Good evening. Welcome to the fourth part in our series on prayer. Last week we looked at heart at rest prayer. We looked at how David in Psalm 4 travels from the distance of being of total chaos to comfort by completely trusting in God's faithfulness and his sovereignty. We learn that this kind of prayer, the heart at rest prayer, surrenders our right to know all, to comprehend all, and to be all, and puts God at the throne of our lives. Now, today I want to look at the other kind of prayer, Psalm 5. I want to look at your kingdom come kind of prayer. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray and say, your kingdom come, it had some very serious ramifications. Asking God for his kingdom to come, his rule to be established, means for him to become the ruler of this earth. Now that's huge because it has political, it has social, and it has economic ramifications. Praying for God's kingdom to come, praying for his rule to be established, means you're asking Jesus to become a global political figure. You're asking for all caste and color related divides to be abolished. You're asking all economic strata to be removed and leveled. You're asking for a righteous rule to be established. That means the end of all wickedness. When you pray this kind of prayer, it demands the world to be changed. And that's what David is doing in Psalm 5, and that's what we're going to focus on this night. Today, he has a similar request from God. David, again, like Psalm 4 in verses 1 and 2, he puts his requests before God. In fact, he cries out to God. His cries are spontaneous. He's bearing his heart out before God. God calls us to do that as a father. He understands that we are his children and that we are in pain, we are struggling, and therefore he calls us to bear our heart out, for us to cry out before him. And then David goes on in verse 3. He says, O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. After putting his heart out, I was crying out to God. He puts himself together and he says, look, I'm going to prepare a sacrifice, and I'm going to wait and watch and see what you're going to do. In essence, David is saying, look, God, I have prayed to you. I have cried out to you. And then rest is in your hand. I'm not going to answer my prayers for you. I'm not going to take things in my hand. I'm not going to take revenge. I'm not going to cut corners. But I am going to put things in your hand because I know that you care for us. And then from then on, verse 4 to verse 6, he again reminds God that, God, you don't like evil. You cannot stand evil. You cannot tolerate evil. He's reminding how the world has become corrupt. Please do something about it. Well, the question is, why does David have to do that? Why does he have to tell God that the world is evil? Doesn't God know that already? You see, we think over the years that the world has deteriorated. It has become more violent. It has become more unsafe, more debaucherous. Whereas the teacher in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 9, he says, what has been, it will be, and what has been done, it will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Do you think God doesn't know what's happening today? Do you think that God didn't know what was happening at David's time? Yet, David reminded him. David reminded him because it showed David's heart, how he hated sin, how he loved God's creation and he hated sin. That's another sign of a man after God's own heart. David is not happy with the status quo. He wants God to do something about it. And in the same breath, if you move on, David praises God while he's telling God his frustrations with the world and how the world has turned out to be. David praises God that in the midst of such a perverse and crooked generation, God has preserved the righteous. While he's talking about the world, while he's saying the world has gone awry, He's praising God that God has preserved his people, that God has brought him out of that misery and made him stand, cleansed him and made him stand in the holiest of holies. David is not comparing his righteousness in contrast to the wickedness of the world, but he's just giving all glory, all praise to God for his loving kindness and his grace. While we are called to hate sin, we are not to forget that we were once sinners. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 that we were also by nature object of wrath, ready to be punished by God. That Paul also establishes in the same breath, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And John says that through Jesus, we received grace upon grace. It's good to hate sin, but we end up hating sinners. But David reminds us that we should always remember that we are saved by grace alone. A prayer like this is often outward. A prayer like this is often prayed when you're tired of looking at the newspapers every day, when you're tired of being fearful in a city which is sinful. A prayer like this is often prayed when when you're troubled by seeing hungry people and hungry children, and all those faces trouble you by day and night. You pray this kind of prayer when you see justice being sold to the highest bidder. The fact is that we live in a city, in a nation where this is the norm. That means our heart should break like David's heart. That means these cries should become a daily part of our prayer life, crying out to God for his kingdom to be established. You see, David was a man after God's own heart. His prayers are drenched with a deep knowledge of God's character, his faithfulness, his sovereignty, his holiness, and his loving kindness. Deep knowledge of God's character comes by experiencing him daily in prayer. Whether it is a heart at rest prayer or change the world prayer, it draws you closer to God and transforms you more in the image of his Son. And my prayer is that you would pray such prayers. My prayer is that you would be so captivated by God's love and his glory that your prayers would transform. That no matter how your external is, your circumstances are, you would put your heart at rest. And that seeing the world, that you would have a burden for it, that you would ask God to establish his kingdom. God bless.